Welcome to part 2 of our video. If you're just finding this video now and you want to go to part 1, you can find the link here. If you're looking for part 3, you can find it here. Remember, all of the timestamps are in the description. Enjoy. So we have pressed our shoulder seams open. It's a little bit of a curve, so take care when you're pressing it. I should mention, are about 40 minutes into our project. We have our pocket sewn, we have our back and front sewn together at the shoulders, and we're ready to stitch the collar. Now, if you're following along in the instructions in the pattern, I told you I would let you know if I was veering from the instructions. At this point in the pattern, they're asking you to sew the side seam, but because the armhole is so straight, sewing the side seam now will make it really hard to sew your sleeve in. So we're gonna do that later. We're changing the instructions. We're gonna sew the sleeve in differently. But now we are gonna go back to the pattern and we are going to sew this there's a hole here between the collar and the back, and that is gonna get stitched. I have marked with a chalk line the marking of the sewing line for the collar. And I've also marked a notch at the center point of the back neckline. So I'm going to get a pin and I'll pin that to the center of the collar. I'm going to apply a few more pins along that raw edge. And then I'll meet you at the sewing machine to sew this collar in place. So I have my stitching line marked with chalk. It's kind of like a odd little dart. I'm not going to do a back stitch. I'm just going to tie that off when I'm finished sewing. Making sure that my shoulder seam stays pressed open. And making sure that the center piece of the collar is matching with my notch on the center of the neckline. Gonna tie off the threads with a nice tidy knot. It's always easier to say than do. I'm going to trim close to the knot, and I'll do the exact same thing at the other end where I started sewing. So we've just sewn that seam where the collar gets joined to the back at the neck edge. At this point, the pattern says to press the seam allowances toward the front of the jacket. I'm not really happy with that. We're going to want to attach the facing to one of the seam allowances here, so I'm actually going to press that open. And then also, because the neck edge is curved, we're going to clip that so that we can press it flat. So I'm just going to put a few clips into the neck edge of the back piece close to where the shoulder seam is, and that will allow us to press the seam a little bit flatter. So this will be a little bit tricky, but we're going to try and lay it as flat as we can at the ironing board and press that seam allowance open. It'll also reduce bulk in the collar because it'll give us a nice flat seam. The fabric we're using is pretty soft, so it's not creating a lot of bulk, but you might be sewing with a heavier kind of mouflon or boiled wool, and that may tend to get a little bit bulkier. As I get toward this little dart that we've done, I'm actually going to stitch the crease of the dart, or not stitch, clip with my scissors to try and press that a little bit flatter. And then for the part, because obviously I can't clip right to the corner because the fabric will fray out, then I'm going to press the rest of the dart towards the front. So I think we'll have to get a bit of a close-up so you can see what I've done. So now that we've got the front and back of the jacket ready, we need to put our facing front and back together. So this is the long facing piece that will go on the jacket. There is a corner that we're going to have to stitch into. So what the pattern says to do, and I agree with this, it's a good idea, we're going to sew with a 5/8 inch seam allowance a sewing guide. So we're basically going to stitch, we're going to pivot, and then we're going to clip to the corner on both of the front facing pieces. We're also going to stay stitch the back facing piece along the neck edge, just like we did for the back of the coat. And then we are going to sew basically again, the back collar. It looks kind of weird, but that's actually the collar. We're going to sew the center back of the collar. So let's head to the machine and we'll do those 3 steps. So the first thing we're going to do is our stitching guide. So I'm going to use my sewing machine as a guide for the 5/8. I've switched to a basting stitch. And then I'm going to carefully cut to that corner without going into it. I'm going to take the back collar facing. I'm going to stitch that. I'm going to switch back to my regular stitch length with a 3/8 of an inch seam allowance because we don't want the stay stitching to show. And the last thing that I said we were going to do is sew the collar pieces together on the facing. That'll be quick. Again, we don't need to, I've got to trim this interfacing a little bit. So I don't need to finish these raw edges because they're going to be enclosed inside the collar. So I'm just going to stitch the back stitch, make it nice and secure. So we're going to head to the iron to press that open. And now that I've got my scissors handy, thanks to our trusty camera person, I'm going to trim that collar that we have stitched pretty close to the corner without going right to the seam. We don't want it to fray out. All right, so we've got a pretty tricky operation. We need to apply the collar to this kind of square opening, which is where we have clipped our corners. That'll definitely help with the operation. And that's going to get sewn to this edge. So I've marked with a notch the center point of this neck facing. I'm going to match that up with the center point of the back collar. We have a seam there that we have pressed open. So we're going to make sure that's nicely lined up with a pin. So we're going to be kind of stitching around a corner. So I'm going to mark the ends. This is where we're going to be stopping and starting sewing. And again, as I mentioned before, we're not lining up the cut edge, we're lining up where we're actually going to be stitching. I'll do that on the other end. Again, this is one of our trickier operations, so I want to make sure to explain it fully. There's also a notch here, so that'll be a bit of a guide for us to know that we're on track. The other thing that's really going to help us out is the stitching we've done to indicate our sewing line on the collar facing. So let's head to the sewing machine and try this operation out. Everybody, keep your fingers crossed. All right, so we're stitching with the facing side up. The back collar facing is on the bottom. So I'm gonna start sewing. I'm gonna make sure I've got my machine set to our normal stitch length, which it is 2.5. I'm going to back stitch. Remove the pin. And again, I've got my guide here, the 5/8 of an inch seam that we have indicated there. And we basically want to sew about 5/8 of an inch from the edge of this seam. So, kind of get that worked out. Continue sewing. I'm pretty much stitching right in the previous stitching. It's probably hard to see with the interfacing there, but I am sewing right on that guide that I made by sewing earlier. I'm going to go right to that point. I'm going to walk the needle over by hand so I don't go too far. I'm going to leave my needle down at that point. I'm going to pivot my work. Try and get it as flat as possible so that I can continue stitching on my marked stitching line. This is basically the back neck edge. Make sure I'm removing all my pins, lining up that cut edge, and sewing right on the stitching guide. The 5/8 of an inch seam allowance. It's going pretty well. We're coming up to the halfway point here of this seam, and that is our center back. If you prefer, you can always base this with your machine to make sure that it's good before you're doing your final stitching. And then you can, if it is good, you can just stitch over your basting. Make sure we don't have any lumps or gathers on the underside. Again, the last stitch I'm going to work by hand to get right into that corner. I'm going to pivot my work again. We're just rounding the corner, coming to the end of this little fun operation. This is probably the trickiest thing with the whole making of this coat. So if you've managed to make it this far unscathed, give yourself a pat on the back. We are about an hour into our sewing. We've got our our facing now made, and we're ready to apply it to the jacket. To make it a little bit easier to press these seams, so this is, so you can see that back neck facing piece. We're going for this inside corner. We're going to trim that corner off. Be careful that we're only stitching through that thickness of fabric. We're going to do that on the other side. Otherwise, it's just causing too much bulk. So trimming that off will allow us to press that short little part of the seam open. So we've sewn that complicated seam. We're now at the ironing board. I'm pressing that short part of the seam open. And like we did on the body of the coat, this kind of curved neck edge is hard to press open if we don't clip it. So I'm going to trim that seam allowance, clip into it a little bit, just to allow me to ease the seam allowance flat with the iron. And I'm actually going to press that open. That is kind of veering from the instructions. I told you I'd let you know if I was doing something different. So the pattern tells you to press it toward the back facing, but I'm pressing it open. I just feel like that'll kind of not have all the bulk in one spot. Something like that. So we have our facing done. We have the coat so far. We're going to now pin the facing to the coat, but I have to say I've just found a problem with the pattern. It shows kind of in the pattern that the bottom edge, the facing, will line up with the bottom edge of the coat, and that is simply not true. The bottom of the front of the coat, the hem is 2 1/4 inches, and the seam allowance on the facing is only 5/8. So what I've done is I've measured up 2 1/4 inches from the cut edge of the front, and I've made a mark, and then I made a mark 5/8 of an inch below that, and that will actually be the matching point for the front facing. Hopefully that makes sense. I'll show you when I'm getting closer to pinning that exact point what I mean. But I'm going to start pinning at the center back collar. I should also mention that on the edge that we're not pinning, I've actually overlocked the edge of the facing because that's a good time to finish it. So I've pinned the center back collar points on the facing and the coat. There is a notch along the kind of neck edge that I'm going to pin as well. Match those points. I'm pinning from the interfacing side because I'm going to be stitching with the facing up and the body of the jacket on the underside. I'm going to line up, find that notch on the other right hand neck edge. And now we're getting to that point that I mentioned before about the length of the facing compared to the length of the coat. So I'm lining up the cut edge of the facing with that mark that's 2 1/4 up and then 5/8 down. That will line up with the bottom of my facing. And when I get to the point, I will be stitching 5/8 of an inch across the bottom of the facing, but we'll worry about that later. So I'm putting in a few more pins to make sure that my jacket, this front edge is going to be obviously right in the center front of the jacket, so we want to make sure we've done a really nice job. I'm going to continue that around the other side of the jacket, and then we will meet at the sewing machine. So I'm going to go back to my straight stitch at my normal stitch length. I'm going to sew right from the cut edge of the facing with the back stitch. We're coming into some bias pieces. It's kind of cut on a diagonal. So we want to make sure not to stretch this as we sew, because if we do, it'll kind of stay stretched out and the jacket will kind of lay away from the body. We want it to hug into the neckline, so we're just going to let the machine do the work, pulling the fabric through. We're coming up to the notch point on that front neck edge. Make sure those notches are lined up. We're coming to the halfway point of the seam. I'm going to make sure that's all lined up nicely and that both of the seam allowance are pressed flat. So we're coming close to the end of the seam. We're going to stitch right to the end of that cut edge of the facing. And then we are going to backstitch. There we have it. The facing is stitched to the jacket. So we have our facing stitched to the front neck edge of our jacket. We need to trim that seam allowance on the facing. So I'm stitching through the interfacing and the facing piece. As you can see, I'm not cutting into the front of the jacket. I'm going to continue all the way around this neck edge and then back down the other side, and then I will show you how to understitch this seam. So once we have our seam allowance graded, we are going to open that seam out. What we're doing now is understitching. So what we do is we actually, with the facing on our left, we're going to push all of the seam allowances to the left as well. And then we're going to stitch very close to this seam, this fold, but just about 1/8 of an inch over from that. Now what that's going to do, it's going to secure all the seam allowances to the facing, so when the facing kind of is in the inside of the jacket, it will roll, all the seam allowances will roll around to the inside of the jacket. So we have our machine set up at a regular straight stitch at a normal length, 2.5, and we're going to sew close to that edge. I'm going to continue through to the other end, and then I will show you how to wrap the facing to the inside. So we've understitched this whole seam where the facing is attached to the coat, and you'll see when we flip the facing to the inside, the facing really naturally wants to roll into the inside of the jacket due to the understitching that we've done. We're going to press it. It's going to make it even nicer roll in. The next step that I want to show you is how to attach the facing to the jacket at the neck edge. This is a very specific technique for doing a jacket. And basically what the pattern does is they have you stitch it by hand, but I'm just going to show you if we lift up the back facing here, you'll see because we've pressed our seam allowances open both on the coat and the facing, we're going to take the one seam allowance that's free with the one seam allowance that's free from the jacket, and we're going to put those together. I'm going to match up the center points. I'm going to put in a pin, and now we can actually, with our machine, we can stitch that together, and what that's going to do is it's going to secure the collar and keep it from rolling around. And the other thing that we're going to do, again, in the pattern it shows that you can hand sew the facing down at the shoulder, but what we're going to do is actually pin it, the back neck facing, to the seam allowance of the shoulder. We're going to put a pin in that, and then we're going to bar tack that in place with the sewing machine. So we're going to avoid a lot of hand sewing that isn't necessary, but before we can do the shoulder, we will go in and sew at the collar, securing the facing in place. Let's do that first.